Sustain267.
Welcome to the Sustain267 Podcast, where we host conversations on climate change and the environment in Botswana and the rest of Africa. I am your host, Patukili Sidze. This is the third episode of an 8-part series of conversations that we'll be sharing with you from the 2021 Global South Women's Forum on Sustainable Development, hosted by the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, a feminist organization committed to the full realization of women's human rights through the pursuit of equality. This episode is day 3 of the Creative and Cultural Corner that was moderated by Nadia Mohd Rasidi, and she's in conversation with Monanja Mwenyewe, a Nairobi-based artist, about his song, You're Enjoying It. Monanja kicked off the conversation by giving a bit of background on the song. The link to the full song, You're Enjoying It, by Monanja Mwenyewe is in the episode notes. Such a beautiful song that I personally enjoyed, listened to on repeat, and highly recommend you listen to. The first question Nadia asked Monanja was, how did he get started in music?
Hello world, privileged to join you at the Global South Women's Forum on Sustainable Development. Yes, my name is Monanja. I'm an artist based in Nairobi, Kenya, East Africa. The song Inakurarukia is a song done in Sheng and Kiswahili. It's based on enjoying. It means enjoying it. You're enjoying it. That's what Inakurarukia means in Sheng. When I was writing it, it really speaks about how the environment is priceless. We don't have to pay for pleasures like this. It's something that we just find, and it's something that no one has to pay for. We don't have to pay for parks. We don't have to pay for nature. It's something. It's a human being's right. And in the song, it addresses the healing quality of the environment, how it can heal our stress. So the first verse talks about I was in the countryside and I was stressed, and I began enjoying the environment, and a crisp breeze hit me, and I was enjoying the environment, and my depression subsided. So we shouldn't, because the chorus says, you're enjoying it, you're enjoying the environment, that is the sun, the air, the fresh air. Not so fresh, of course, in the cities these days, unfortunately. But you're enjoying these pleasures that you don't have to pay for, without paying for it. And then the second verse is an ode to Wangari Maathai, who we all know, for those of you who know Wangari Maathai, she is the late Wangari Maathai, I beg your pardon. She struggled on so many fronts, but I guess the world knows her mainly for her struggles on environmental justice. She struggled to protect a public space in Kenya, actually 2 public spaces. Uhuru Park, which the then government of President Moi tried to encroach on and tried to build a party headquarters in a park that was supposed to be enjoyed by the public. And then later on, about 9 years later, there's a forest called Karura Forest, which a number of individuals, a number of politicians, influential people in government were encroaching on. And she said, no, we can't do this. Of course, she not only, those 2 fights are just part of what we see out there, but she really did a lot of work working with women from rural areas who were unable to access firewood. And this is something that if you go through a documentary on YouTube, you're going to find that was tied to environmental degradation, So that's about it. So Inakurarukia is generally a song that calls on humanity to enjoy the environment, protect the environment, and demand that the environment is actually, it's something that we should not pay for. It fights against the idea of commoditization of the environment, as well as an ode to the contributions that the late Wangari Maathai did. Thank you. How I started to do music. I guess I always gravitated to music as a child, and I guess I'm lucky to have found what I feel is my purpose, like writing music that speaks to our lives, that speaks to the human experience. So I guess it's just a journey of self-discovery. I don't really think I'm done with discovering myself, and it's also not a question of the I as such. I think it's also a question of maybe working with other people and seeing how they can also discover themselves. And maybe I know that I also have privilege, and I think how can I use that privilege for the better of the world? So yeah.
I see. Thank you for sharing that. I'm just interested in learning a bit more about the context of what it's like to be an artist and a musician in Kenya. You're based in Kenya right now, are you?
Yes.
Yeah, could you talk a bit more about what the art scene or the music scene is like, and your sort of the position that you occupy there?
So I guess the art scene in Kenya, of course, there are academics who say that, who argue that we are courtesy of the colonialism, but the British, to the approach, are very Philistine, like in the sense of art is not considered not just lucrative, but prestigious. I think prestigious would be the right one. And I think for some of us who move beyond the idea of living for prestige, that can be tricky surviving. So art in Kenya, survival is tricky to survive as an artist, just as a performing artist. Moreover, as an artist who makes music that isn't necessarily mainstream, isn't necessarily based on pop messages, and has a more political bent, so to speak. So as an artist, I say as an artist, and I wouldn't want to, I think if I call myself progressive artist, I think that's kind of vague. I think that's a label that I believe people to deal with and give me. But I'd say that as an artist who takes an interest in making music that says something, and I think the opportunities for survival are not that many. Nevertheless, it's purpose that you derive. It's the purpose that I think moves me more than the money making. Although that could be important to some extent, but I think it's more or less a fight between the ego and the soul, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that. I was just curious about what it's like to be an artist, and I think what you've just shared with us right now is something that's come up. This is the third day of our creative and cultural sessions, and we've spoken to previously someone who writes fiction and someone who writes poetry, and they've said similar things. Kind of when you're someone who's approaching issues that not necessarily are extremely mainstream, there's always that sort of challenge and tension in terms of how you want to be seen and how you're perceived and what you're trying to get across. Because you're right, like there's an assumption of some things only being worth pursuing if they're prestigious or they confer some sort of respectability. And I think there's a lot of work in art that kind of pushes back against that idea, right? And I'm really appreciative of you saying that. I know that you introduced your piece and talked about how how it came about, sort of. But would you be able to talk just a bit more in detail about the creative process of writing this piece, and maybe in general, just what your creative process is? Because I know you said it was partly influenced by the work of Wangari Maathai, which is amazing. I know she's an inspiration for a lot of us. But yeah, just if you could elaborate a bit more about what led you to write this specific piece. Did you write this recently? Like, is this something that you wrote in the past year during COVID, or is it before?
Yeah, you're actually right. Like the pandemic is we're not really out of the pandemic right now. But I wrote it at the height of it all, like when you have a lot of solitude, and as an artist, again, as I said, survival is not easy, particularly at the time of a pandemic when people couldn't perform because the pubs were closed and so many fora couldn't take place. So survival was tricky. And I derive a lot of, I feel that the environment can be healing. Just sitting in a field, sitting below trees, to me, I find healing. I know it sounds weird, I guess, to some of the people who I speak with, but I would visit as a place, maybe about 20 kilometers from my place, that I would visit and just take in the air and just enjoy what I don't have to pay for. All I just had to pay was probably my transport. And I guess there's that feeling of you're so little you're one person in a field and there's so many trees. Of course, there may be other people, but there's a feeling of there's so much beyond me. I'm just like a tree. I'm just like, maybe I'm actually less than a tree because a tree supports more birds and more and ants and so on and so forth. So I didn't even think about Wangari Maathai's contribution came later, because yes, she's a woman who has influenced. She was a woman who influenced me, whose struggles I saw and were pretty cross-cutting, like how she was able to tie the political and the environment, and like how her political struggles were cross-cutting. I think that's the main expert for me. But when I wrote about the environment, I was like, okay. The first song is more or less telling people, look, you have stress. If you can, this is the solution to your stress. Enjoy the trees around you. If you have trees, and I know that this is also a question of privilege, enjoy the breeze around you, enjoy the fresh air. If you're in a space that can have the fresh air, of course, I do know that is also a product of privilege, because not everyone lives in such spaces. But then the second one becomes more preachy. Like, so I think people generally do not, and I'm sorry if I sound a little bit cynical, people usually react if you have a solution to their problems. So like writing the first verse will say, this is a solution to your problems. You have stress, go sit under a tree, enjoy the breeze. It's priceless, and it shouldn't come at a price. Then now the second verse is when I now start going to teachings. Like, this is what Wangari Maathai did. She stood up against greedy people who are trying to grab Karura Forest for their own benefit, and she put her life on the line for that. So it's a song that was born, I guess, in the midst of a pandemic, but of course influenced by the past that Wangari Maathai. And then, of course, I also talk about colonialism in the song. There's a part where I say that mazingira tuliyojaliwa in Kiswahili, that's saying that the environment that human beings were gifted with has been or was affected by imperialism, was affected by colonialism, because colonialism affected the environment. There's the environmental effect. If not warfare, then building factories and so on and so forth. So it was a song that was informed by the then present, and as well as the past, which was even before me, colonialism again. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing that context. Two things that come to mind when you talk about this for me, if it's okay for me to share. One is that when you talked about commoditization of public spaces, it made me think about how I lived in London briefly, and so I still keep tabs about what's going on there. And there have been they don't have many public swimming spaces, but there are a couple. But over the course of the pandemic, under the guise of public health regulations, they have limited access to these spaces. They've started charging people to access these spaces. And there's a sign-up sheet, but obviously any sort of financial barrier creates restrictions. And it's cutting off access to greenery, to nature, to the environment, to people who already have very limited access in a city that's, heavily industrialized and commercialized. And the other thing was, in terms of what you were saying about enjoyment, is related to what's going on in Malaysia. We've been under lockdown for much of the pandemic, really, since March of 2020. And we recently starting to open up. And one of the things that are opening up is the cinema. And some politicians and some people have said that, oh, it's very frivolous to be reopening the arts at this point. And I think that sort of speaks to how art and joy are perceived in times of crisis as something superfluous, something that's not needed, something that can be lower ranked and pushed aside until the important things are taken care of. And I think what your work is doing, from what I understand, is kind of pushing back against that idea. Like what you're saying is that the environment and the joy that we derive from the environment is very much central to the recovery, not just from COVID, but from the sort of neoliberal capitalist world that we live in. Is it, just am I right, or is there something in there that you agree with?
Yeah, I mean, I resonate with what you say. Of course, the environment has several uses. I mean, again, the person is a political, so I'm coming from. I was speaking from my perspective. Like I was enjoying, but of course, there are people who actually depend on firewood, but back to what you were saying on neoliberalization, it's you have recently there's a park in Nairobi called Arboretum where they closed it, and then they closed it for a while, and then they now introduced an entrance fee, 50 shillings. 50 shillings would be maybe $50, but 50 shillings is a lot for people. And I think anything in this world should be enjoyed by everyone, particularly if what you're doing is not for the marginalized, those people who do not have access. Well, I'd say those people who have been denied access because of capitalism, because of colonial capitalism in our case that we are perpetuating. I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong for things that were gifted by the universe, depending on, of course, one's spiritual belief, by God, by the universe, or we found it here. One shouldn't commoditize it, because, I mean, what are we saying? If you can't even enjoy a tree, how can you pay for a tree? I sometimes think to myself, so we're in a city, Nairobi, I sometimes think that, when someone is pressed and needs to pass water, they have to pay 10 shillings. Then I think 200 years ago, if our ancestors probably would look and see, like, one would have to pay pass water, one would have to pay to help themselves, like, ridiculous when you actually think. I think the introduction of currency, the introduction of money, not just even commoditization, but even monetization itself, it really is regressive, in my view. I think it's regressive. I think we need to move to a society where we don't have to pay for what we deserve, what everyone should deserve. You don't have to pay to see a tree, to hug a tree, to lie on grass. Like, this is a simple pleasure. So yeah, and I guess one of the things that also influenced this was this tendency, this neoliberal tendency, not just neoliberal, there's infrastructural. You probably heard of the term Africa is rising. And they build so many buildings and so many roads which are superfluous. I mean, like, why do we need all of these roads? Like, and why do they have to come at a cost of the environment? And there's an expressway being built from the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport to a prestigious neighborhood in Nairobi. And no one, actually, it's the rich who are going to use that expressway. And so many trees have been felled. Like, it's going to be heat wave after heat wave in Nairobi. It's like, it's just crazy. We're no longer the city, the green city under the sun. We're just the city under the sun now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting it. That's a very, very stark change when you remove the greenery. It makes me think, recently I took a walk around my own neighborhood, and I saw a lot of flyers on my neighbors' homes protesting the building of a highway that's coming up. And it's not a highway that anyone needs, because again, as you said, it's linking two areas that already have a lot of connections, that have a lot of access, and it's just another way of increasing profit. And I'm glad that you brought this up, because I did a bit of research on you before speaking to you, and I came across an interview that you did, and I apologize, I can't remember which organization it was with, but you talk a bit about how when people talk about Africa, they think of it, or they discuss it at least in a very monolithic way, and they use the Western lens of attributing any sort of strife to tribalism, and tribalism acts as sort of a way to obscure the question of class. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your understanding of class, specifically in Kenya, is, or if you want to talk generally in Africa, but yeah, just your understanding of class and how exactly you engage with that in your work. I would really love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so class is, so I think what we can see concretely, I think what a concrete reality is in the history of the continent. I think when colonialism, and this is not to romanticize the Africa of the past, colonialism introduced, or it made the classes more clear cut. So you had, and especially in our case, Kenya was a settler colony. You had the class, the settler class was replaced by an indigenous elite. By an indigenous elite became the ruling elite, and by default the settler class. So what happens is, one of the tactics that this indigenous elite would use to protect power is to weaponize the ethnicity, because that divides now, there are a number of ethnic groups in Kenya. There's a Kikuyu, there's a Luo, there's a Meru, there's a Kalenjin, so on and so forth. But now if you use your political influence, if you use the elite that has already taken the reins of power from the colonialists from left, and then you weaponize it. And the way they used it was as a means of protecting their power, because a number of the incumbent government comes in, and then you have disaffected voices within the elite saying, no, power should actually benefit, real benefits. Independence should come with real benefits to the people. So the landless should have land, and those who do not have jobs should have jobs, and so on and so forth. But now the ruling elite uses ethnicity and says, now we are Kikuyu, and this is an attack against our ethnicity. And now that has the effect of fragmenting any possibility of inter-ethnic solidarity, based on class. And so, like, in my work, I think the work is cut out for me. Another artist, of course. It's not just something that I've been doing alone. I think that the challenge is to show people, or to demonstrate how ethnicity is a secondary contradiction, but class is a concrete contradiction. Even when we talk about gender, patriarchy is there, but there's a capitalism element, that makes the man have the money, therefore the man bringing in money, and therefore oppress the wife, and so oppress sister, and so on and so forth. So I think the key is to show, even within the genders, even among women, there's a rich woman, there's a poor. So how do you demonstrate that class is the major contradiction? I think that's the challenge. I think that's the challenge that we have cut out for us as artists, as academics, as cultural producers in the world, to show people that the people who are most severely affected by oppression, for the most part, are those who are excluded from class. But of course, there are other subcategories, paying attention to gender, to sexual orientation, to race, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a challenge. The challenge is to demonstrate that, and then how can we build these solidarities together. And because I think liberation should speak to the interest of the most severely affected people by oppression. That's how I'd sum it up.
Thank you. I think you've summed that up really well. And it brings me actually to another bit from the interview that I read that stood out to me. I'm just going to read the quote from you, if you don't mind. So I didn't write down the question, but you said that I mostly rap and sing in Kiswahili and Sheng. This makes the ideas I've learned from academia, which is usually in esoteric English, more accessible to Kenyans, many of whom speak in Kiswahili or Sheng. It has provided a medium through which I can make complex ideas simple and actionable for people. And this has come up in our conversations with the other artists that we've spoken to as well, right? What the role of art and artists as interpreters. I really resist the idea that people who aren't academics or, people who don't work at institutional high levels can't grasp these ideas if they're not dumbed down. That's not what art is doing, but it's about making it not just accessible, but really urgent and immediate and relatable. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the art that you're making, is that something that you see as a priority? Because I think there's sort of a tension between, making art that speaks to a lot of people, that people can access and can, see reflected in their own lives, versus kind of representing a very specific experience of your own life. I just wonder if you'd be able to elaborate a bit more on that.
So yes, I think as an artist, I have to get out of myself. I have to, because I also do political work. I work with communities. I organize, and I ask myself, so how am I stepping out of my privilege, and how can I learn? How can I take the experiences of course, with their permission? There's a Tanzanian hip hop group called Danielle Hip Hop that works with. It's a hip hop group. They write songs about the experiences of displaced villagers and bus drivers who are about to go on strike. But they'll go and interact with them. Shout out to Danielle Hip Hop. So this is something that I have to get out of myself. I have to get out of my comfort and not just sing about the issues that are personal to me or people within my network, which of course again is defined by my class. So getting out of myself is a challenge. Getting out of this bubble, and of course, like the rest is I've been. There's a group that I've been working with for a while. They are former, recently released prison inmates, and they go through a lot when they're released. They go through a lot because there's ostracization, there's you being a marked man by the police, and so on. So this is not something that I've gone through personally, but how can I chat with them and say, okay, I'd like to write a song? And I think this is something that artists should do. Art shouldn't be this inward-looking thing. It's just about me. I think for it to have political potential, political problem-solving potential, it has to go beyond one's privilege. It has to speak to the problems of those. And you raise these issues, and people would say, people actually go through these problems. I did not know, because everyone has a voice, ultimately, but there are certain factors, of course, that will prevent the accessibility of the information that speaks to the troubles that people go through, the downtrodden people will go through. So I think, as an artist, it is of critical importance, I feel, to get out of one's privilege and create, of course, we are all oppressed, of course, or many of us are oppressed. but create from the standpoint of those who are most severely affected by oppression. I think the question of language for me was, I used to be a part-time history lecturer, and I could see some of my students, because the medium of instruction in Kenya, as far as education is concerned, is English. And I could see some of my students struggle. And it really pained me. I'd mark their papers. Of course, maybe I would want to penalize, because, you're supposed to write in good English. But what are we even saying? Like, it's like giving a fish the standard of a cheetah. Like a fish running as fast as a cheetah. Like, what are we even saying? They didn't grow up speaking English, So I guess that's the way. How can you make political messages? How can you make art, whatever you make, not just art, be accessible to the marginalized? Yeah.
I think you've really put it excellently, that description of, imposing expectations on people that aren't relevant to their own specific experiences and their context is really key. And I think it's a really generous way of approaching your art. Like, it's not something that's inward looking or, sort of very self-serving, but very, using it as a medium of connection. Another thing that stood out to me from the interview, I really loved the line where you say that power cedes nothing without a demand. I think that's a really powerful way of thinking about it. And especially in the context of the past year and a half, like globally, not just in Kenya, not just in Kuala Lumpur, in KL, in Malaysia, especially right now, I would say that we're really struggling with making these demands of our government, and sort of trying to balance survival with making these demands is really challenging, because you're sort of trying to just get through the day. And that is one way that those in power keep other people down, right? By making it impossible for us to think of anything else except getting to the next day or the next moment or the next week. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this, this phrase that you've used in terms of how it relates to the environmental justice movement. I'm thinking of like the way forward, right? Like, what are we demanding in this present moment in terms of climate justice, in terms of the climate crisis? Maybe you can talk specifically about your experience in Kenya, or if you want to speak more generally, I'd be happy to hear that too.
So one of the parts that earlier on I mentioned the part that we began levying entrance fees, 50 shillings, and we tried as hard as we could. Some of us got threats to ensure that the park would be enjoyed by everyone. But again, the neoliberalization of everything, like you have to pay for the park to be maintained, forest rangers and so on and so forth. And survival, of course, became an issue. Survival for many of us, because we wanted this to be enjoyed by everyone. But survival, you have to eat, you have to pay rent, you have to. The way out of it, in my view, is I think people should be members of progressive movements. I think that's the first thing. Like, you can't fight a war as an individual. But that you can only do so much. You can only do so much. So you have to be part of a movement. I think a progressive movement at that. More importantly, seeing as how survival is an issue, and seeing as how sometimes what you think are change makers, sometimes you have to sometimes pick the struggle that you're picking up is sometimes funded by, in many cases funded by Western capital, and means that you have to, that it's a certain framework. This is what you want to fight for, and it's provided by the donors. And they are good people, they are good donors. I'm not going to take that away from them. But it would be best for such organizations, such progressive movements that one would be a member of, to have an internal agenda, an agenda of its own, not just the donor's agenda. Most importantly, self-reliance. Self-reliance is what fosters this. Like if you are a member of an organization, a progressive organization, in my view, this is me just thinking ideally, we have, some of our movements that we have been part of have been struggling with self-reliance. And we touch and go for a while, but I can't stress enough the importance of being self-reliant as an organization, that it produced its own agenda. And from there, I think you would have a reference point. You would have your own, each organization will have its own ethos on this is what is important to us. And the environment, this is where the environment touches our organization. And speaking to that and the challenges of neoliberal capital, how would you face that down, informed by the ethos of the organization, informed by the domain of the organization? I think self-reliance is the way to go as far as sustaining the struggle. I think self-reliance, definitely. And of course, calling some of these actors into account. Why do you need a road? Like, what is that road? Who is that road serving? And at what effect? But if you define your own as an organization, as a progressive movement, if you define your own path first, that should be the reference point, rather than being reactive and saying, the government has done this, we're going to react like this. So I think our organizations have to be grounded with some certain ideology, some certain ethos. I think that's what I said earlier on. And that would guide us as an ideology, the ideologies that we have, that would guide us in our struggles for a better environment, a better world, I think. So, yeah.
Thanks for saying all that. That was a really comprehensive vision of the way forward. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of, if you're an individual within this movement and the movement on a larger scale, you absolutely do have to have your own agenda, because it's so easy for these things to be co-opted in a very nebulous, in a very insidious way, like in a way that you don't even realize. Like there's always that line to balance between getting these messages and this support into the mainstream, and then having that message or the power of your movement diluted in order to become more palatable, to become more safer, really. And I think for me, at least, that time of playing it safe has sort of passed. It's a time now, I think, for all of us to really mobilize in a way that really pushes for change in a very urgent sort of way. I think we can. I just have one last question for you. Just to note that Marissa's saying in the chat that she really appreciates how you spoke to life, environment, and movement in itself. I think you've summed it up really wonderfully, and it speaks to all the themes that we've been talking about and what we're trying to focus on at GSWF. One last question that I would have for you is just to sort of ask, in terms of your own work in the future, and maybe whether it's the next few weeks, months, or years, where do you see your work going? What do you have planned, or is there? Yeah, just what does the future hold for you in terms of your work, your activism, and your art?
I just hope my work somehow makes people, improves the welfare of people. I just hope that like people change. I hope, I imagine, and I hope that I'll strive to make music that speaks beyond my experience, and just music that uplifts people, that not just emotionally, but inspires people to take charge, to maybe learn something new, and like face down oppression. Most importantly, face down oppression. And yeah, I hope that doesn't change.
I mean, judging by what we heard today and what you've shared with us, I have complete faith that your work is going to do that. It was really wonderful to hear your music and to hear you talk about it. Are there any last things that you'd like to share with us before we close the session?
No, I'm grateful for the questions, for stretching my mind to the limits, and I'm really, really grateful for this. And I've also been following some of the sessions, and thank you for the work that you've been doing. Women Hold Up the Sky. I haven't yet completed the documentary that you guys were showing yesterday. I was a little bit busy, but I'll definitely follow up on the activity. So you guys are doing a splendid job, and I'm privileged to be in your presence. Please keep on, keep on doing the good work. I'm really grateful for you having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for saying that. Just before we go, Danielle wasn't able to join us today, but I'm just going to briefly share her art, if that's all right. So this is a piece called Sacred Self. This one is called She Sees a Whole World. And this one is called Take Flight. If I can share just a little bit of what I did some background reading on Danielle as well. And, she's not here to speak for herself, but if from the art that we've seen, her art centers largely on the feminine, self-love, and identity, and is deeply rooted in Trinidadian culture, landscape, and mythology. And it's really beautiful. And if anyone would like to see more of her work, these pieces are available on the ERA website under this session. I think that's all for our cultural corner today.
Thank you so much to Nadia and Monanja for the conversation. This was the third episode of an 8-part series from the 2021 Global South Women's Forum on Sustainable Development, hosted by the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific. These sessions, including the daily creative and cultural corners, are available with visuals on the ERAW YouTube page, and the link to that is in the episode notes. You will also have an opportunity to see Danielle Boodoo-Fortune's 3 pieces, Take Flight, She Sees a Whole World, and Sacred Self. Thank you for taking time to listen to the Cultural and Creativity Corner Day 3 episode on Sustain267 Podcast. Let's connect on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter on our handle @Sustain267 and share your thoughts on the conversation and Monanja's song, You're Enjoying It. I am the host of Sustain267 Podcast, Batokili Sidze, and the sound engineer is Malehoma Khoti. Please subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast to listen to more conversations on climate change and environment through African voices. Take care.
Sustain267.